What's up, guys? Welcome into another edition of Bogey Free. We are. I'm taking a break from golf because Tony Finau has ruined my entire fucking weekend, and we are talking some NFL wide receivers with Josh Hermsmeyer. You can find him on Twitter at Frisco Josh. What's going on, man? How we doing tonight?
Matt, I'm having a good time. Football is back. We're watching some meaningless preseason and coming to a lot of really strong and probably ill-conceived conclusions. It's just a tremendous day, and I couldn't be happier.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to see the ADP swings tomorrow morning when I fire up a couple of best ball drafts.
You know what? And I think when you can draw like solid conclusions and really leverage your pre-existing bias based on one play, I think your process is correct and you're on the right track for a really stellar fantasy season.
Just got to do it. Every time you see something new, completely change everything you believed. What could go wrong?
That's right. That's right.
All right. So why don't we? Obviously, you're sort of the at least in my eyes, you're like the wide receiver guy, even though you obviously have a larger knowledge base than that. But when I was thinking about doing sort of positional shows, talk a little bit about best ball and things like that, you were the first guy I thought of. So thanks for hopping on tonight.
Well, I appreciate that. I wouldn't call myself the wide receiver guy. I think there's a lot of guys who do tons of great work. Matt Harmon, obviously, is one that pops immediately to mind, but I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, you interacted with me when I was just a young lad on Twitter. So you always have the first shot at whenever I think of something. I'm always willing to have you on.
Right on.
So let's jump right in and sort of start off with just sort of like some general talk about wide receivers in general. I know a lot of people, whether they try to come up with their own rankings in their head with any real process or looking at last year's stats and things like that to try and inform their decisions as they look towards this year. And obviously, if you've read Josh's stuff before, you know a lot of this. But for those unfamiliar, what are some things that you're looking for, sort of like for a year-over-year basis that you think can inform us on what we can expect this year?
Yeah, I think it's pretty common knowledge, but sometimes we are led astray. We kind of look at different things that we probably shouldn't. But the common knowledge is that volume is what creates fantasy value. And so targets has long been, well, not long been, as long as I've been playing fantasy football, targets have been the only measure of volume that anyone really cares about or measured. And when I discovered air yards data, I was able to kind of add a layer to those targets, a layer of information that kind of shows you how much yardage is behind each of those targets. And the more yardage behind a target on average, the more valuable the target is. And so kind of combining those two things together and saying how many targets on the team, the percentage of the team's target share does a guy get? What's his share of air yards? And kind of combining those two things really creates a very predictive metric for fantasy. It's a great way to draft if you just want to use one number. And so, yeah, it always comes back to this idea of, is the guy going to get targets? And it's not just volume in a way that we kind of think about volume and as being this thing that's empty or is not indicative of real talent. You earn targets in the NFL. You earn targets by getting separation. You earn targets by just being good. Even if you have no separation, the team trusts you, draws up plays for you. There might be back shoulder throws. They might be deep, 35% tosses just because they believe in your talent. And so all of those things, when you combine them together, it makes the targets, it makes the air yards predictive. It makes the air yards a good predictor of who's actually good, rather than efficiency metrics that we might always rely on, like yards per target.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So as we'll get a little bit deeper into wide receivers in general in just a couple of minutes, but I did a show last week with James Coe, formerly of the NFL Network. We talked a lot about best ball strategy in general. So if you didn't hear that, you can sort of go backwards and hear some of my thoughts and James's thoughts. But while I have you, Josh, what are you big into best balls? What are you doing this time of year draft wise?
Well, I moved from California to Northern Idaho about 8 months ago, and up here in the Pacific Northwest is glorious, it's beautiful, but there's no best ball.
No.
You just can't play. You can't play DFS, can't play best ball. So I haven't been big into it. I've been doing a lot of full season drafting and MFL stuff when I can, because that isn't blocked. But MFL 10s specifically draft those best ball leagues. Are not something I've played a lot of this year. That aside, I did do a lot of best ball research this year, posted some of my findings and my research along with TJ over at 4for4, and I would definitely check that out. It's got some good strategic information in there about how you should approach each position, and more importantly, how you should approach playing best ball. And one of the things that I would say just in general when you're going to play a game like that is that you want to get enough volume that you expose yourself to the draft picks that are going to give you the highest win rate. That's the first five. It really is the case that the back end, you're talking 9, 10, 11, 12, those picks have a much, 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 much lower win rate historically in best ball than those others. So you want to play enough that you get exposure to those early round picks in some of your drafts, gives you a nice portfolio of best ball. Such that you may get lucky on your back end drafts, but you're really going to make your money back on those early draft picks.
Yeah, for sure. And so when I've sort of been bouncing back and forth with this a little bit, I'm very much a 0 RB guy 90% of the time, and then every so often I lose my path a little bit. But this year especially, it seems like people are extremely confident in this year especially, meaning like since the last, I don't know, maybe since 2014. It seems like they're especially confident that like running backs are becoming somewhat invincible, and just sort of relying on that to start off their drafts. I know you've done a lot of work with like injury rates and things of that nature. Maybe you could just talk for a second about sort of the value of 0 RB and how you think that's going to be applied for this year, or is it something that you think is can sort of swing back and forth?
Yeah, so there's two parts to 0 RB, and I think sometimes it gets a bad rap as people say you're playing it safe. And not betting on the high-scoring running backs because if they don't get injured, you will win your league. Something like that is the common argument for taking those running backs early. But the truth of the matter is, if you look historically, like for instance, last year Todd Gurley was the RB1. The chances of him repeating as RB1 in the past 15 years is less than 5%. So that's not entirely true. So Adrian Peterson did it once, and LaDainian Tomlinson did it once. So that if you think that Todd Gurley is on their level, okay, first of all, and you believe that you're going to miss the injury bug, then there is a chance that he could repeat. But the odds are so poor. And when you couple that with the finding that over 20%, well, around 70%, 17% of running backs in the top 3 spots, not RB3. I'm talking top 3 running backs, RB1, RB2, RB3. The top 3 running backs in fantasy come from past the 5th round, 17%. Then what you do is you couple that with this notion that the top 24 wide receivers are injured at a much, much lower rate than the rest of the wide receiver population, that they're much safer picks, that the ability for us to forecast the performance is much better. Then what falls out of all of that kind of data mining and all those findings is really this notion that you're going to pick in the high leverage rounds these wide receivers that are probably going to return value, and then you bet the house that on that 17% shot that you'll find an RB 1, 2, or 3 past the 5th round. And you might do that on the waiver wire. You might do it in the draft. I mean, last year people were drafting Kamara, and he turned out to be a running back 2 or 3. I was huge on Hunt coming into the preseason, not way before then, but when I saw him play in the preseason, coupled with all of his broken tackles before Ware got injured, I was like, this guy is going around the 5th round. He's a perfect 0 RB candidate. And I think this year you're going to see guys like that too. I think guys like Geiser, if his knee is okay, he got injured tonight in preseason, or a guy like Penny, even though there's a lot of shade going on right now about Carson, I think those are guys that are probably going to fall in value, going to be available well after the 5th round. And they're definitely guys that you could scoop up later and can help you win your league while you take guys like, say, AJ Green and Julio in the first 2 rounds.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of that conversation sort of gets lost when people have the argument based on like how guys finish the year. So like, RBs 1 through 12 or 12 through 24, however you want to measure it. But those aren't the guys that were drafted there. And I think that kind of gets lost in a lot of these arguments on Twitter also, where if you look at expected points for each draft slot, whether it's a first-round RB or first-round wide receiver, and work your way down, it shows itself up pretty quickly. I'll probably in the next like week or so, I'm working on an article about that. So that'll be out shortly as well. All right. So why don't we get into some, some specifics here with the wide receivers. Obviously we know a lot of the early round guys, you've probably heard a million different shows or read articles about how great, the Antonio Browns and Odell Beckhams of the world are. But I was curious to hear your take on maybe is there a guy going, I don't know, like the first 10 to 12 wide receivers that you think is overpriced?
Sure. Yeah, I think Nuke is. And last year I was big on him because he came off a year where he got a lot of volume but didn't produce. It was one of those things where volume was not matching up with his efficiency. He had all this volume and he had a low efficiency. Well, this past year, he not only had ridiculous volume, like unbelievable volume, but he was also efficient and caught a lot of touchdowns. We know touchdowns are not sticky. They're not something you can count on repeating year over year. And in other words, they're fairly random. They do go together with volume, but Nuke is going too high. He's going as wide receiver 2, where I think there's probably 5 or 6 wide receivers that should be going ahead of him, even given his amazing volume from last season. And I'm a volume guy. I started this entire podcast out talking about volume. But I think you need a couple volume with an idea of regression in terms of efficiency. And efficiency, you can measure it in terms of points, fantasy points, which include touchdowns. And so when you have the catch rate, the number of yards after the catch, and touchdown, when all those things are over expected, when all those things are well over historical norms for that player, you want to expect that that's going to actually go back to his career mean the next season. And people don't do that, right? That's just not how fantasy works. They look at last season's standings, they look at last season's points, and they say that's what's going to happen this year. Draft him second.
Yeah, exactly. And he's over the past couple of weeks on MFL 10s, he's gone anywhere from 3rd overall to 14th overall. So depending on where you're drafting, he's definitely going reasonably high. So the only wide receivers who have gone higher than him, Antonio Brown has gone 1st overall over the past couple of weeks, and Davante Adams has actually gone 1st overall, not wide receiver, just actually 1st overall. And I've had a hard time sort of figuring out what I want to do with Davante Adams. So I would love I'd love your take on him as well.
So it's an incredible thing with Aaron Rodgers. He's actually not a hugely efficient guy when it comes to yards per target, yards per play, completion percentage, all these different measures that we have for quarterback play. He's relatively mediocre. Where he is absolutely elite, incredible, like historically good, is in TD rate. He has an ability to just create, get out of the pocket, wait, broken plays, whatever it might be, the ability to throw people open. He has this incredible ability in a compressed red zone to really make really just difficult throws, incredible plays, and score touchdowns. I tend to think that means he's an incredible quarterback, and that all those other measures are just somehow wrong. But as it pertains to his wide receivers, if you have a quarterback that can throw you touchdowns and every year seems to make those type of plays, then you have to bump him up some ranks. Even if you believe the touchdowns are fairly random, if you have Aaron Rodgers as your quarterback and he can create the way he can, then yeah, you definitely have to think Davante Adams has got a pretty good shot of scoring some points next year. However, first overall, ahead of Odell Beckham, ahead of Antonio Brown, like ahead of AJ Green, ahead of Michael Thomas, who's got a stellar quarterback of his own. Like that's crazy. And I kind of put Davante Adams and maybe wide receiver 8 or 9.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. He's going 7th in the wide receiver ranks in most drafts, behind a few of the guys that you just mentioned, but ahead of AJ Green. So, so what, as you mentioned, Michael Thomas, I'm curious your take on the how the targets are going to shake out this year in New Orleans because of the suspension. I'm of the mindset that I don't really see them just driving Alvin Kamara into the ground the first couple games while Ingram's out. So I don't know. Maybe this is asking this a little bit too early before we've really seen a lot. But what's your take on Michael Thomas? Do you think New Orleans gets back a little bit more towards like pass happy, or do you think it's a situation where they really are going to continue to lean on the run and figure it out like they did last year?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know that they were such a run first team last year. I just think they were trying to protect Breeze a little bit. I honestly don't think he's washed at all. I think he's got another great couple seasons left in him. And Michael Thomas, again, the thing that is predictive is volume. And then you couple it with efficiency and you regress it to their career mean and you compare it to their quarterback. And then you say, what is their offensive line? You do all those things. He's a top 5 wide receiver. So I think he's a no doubter. I think he's really going to be a wide receiver 1 this year. And you really should take him without too much worry about what's going to happen with the running game. The running game's the running game. I mean, it's nonsense in the NFL. I mean, when I've done as much studying on this as anyone. I think everyone else has come to the same conclusions. It's just they run too much. Teams run too much in the NFL. And so if the loss of Ingram to suspension makes them pass more, it'll probably be better for the team as a whole. I think they underachieved last year, and I think that was due to their emphasis on the run. And I just don't see that repeating.
Yeah, absolutely. And then speaking of suspensions, this is a little bit more tied to a wide receiver, but with Evans and Winston looking to miss the first few games of the season, how much of a knock are you taking off of his projection for this year with Evans? Do you think he's being drafted? He's like wide receiver 9 right now. Do you think that's too much given the suspension, or do you think that price is about right?
So I had him, my model had him, not me. Again, I want to stipulate that my opinions that I give are kind of colored. I'm shading my model. I rely on the model. This is not that I'm some amazing analyst. I run the model and I trust it. I think it's a lot less biased than people. I think we tend to overweight things that we shouldn't and underweight things that we should weight higher. And anyway, it has him at wide receiver 7 and his ADP is wide receiver 9. We're talking about tenths of a point per game difference here. I mean, I can't tell you that either one is right or wrong. I think he's being drafted probably about where he should.
I think that's fair. All right. And the last couple of guys I sort of wanted your take on, we're out of sort of the wide receiver 1s at this point, but pretty high wide receiver 2 picks in Tyreke Hill and Amari Cooper, who personal, his history aside, because I know you obviously are not the biggest fan of Tyreke Hill, as most people shouldn't be as a person, but as a player, I just get the feeling that he's being drafted at his ceiling right now. But I would also love your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to think that's true, but my model is kind of doesn't know anything about what a terrible human being is, and it has him outside the top 36. So it's not my biases aside, and that would definitely color any ranking I put on Reek Hill. Last of his name, puncher of the unborn. Like this guy is just terrible person, and so I would definitely knock him down. But my model doesn't know anything about that, and it
Mhm.
doesn't like him as a top 36 wide receiver. So you take that for what it's worth. Maybe you think that makes my model dumb. I tend to think I tend to trust the model. The model's been right more often than it's not. It likes Amari Cooper as wide receiver 34, and it likes his battery mate Jordy Nelson much more. Loves Jordy Nelson. He likes him as a wide receiver 1 this year. And I think, when you think about all that, and by the way, it knows that Jordy Nelson's on the Raiders. I think that when you look at that, what the model's looking at is not just that he played with Aaron Rodgers, right, and that made him efficient and score a lot of touchdowns. I think what it's looking at is that every year Amari Cooper's been in the league, his battery mate has been the wide receiver 1. He's never been the guy. So why should we suddenly think he's the guy? And why should we think that Jordy Nelson isn't good anymore? One season of 480 yards makes us forget that 2 seasons ago he was the wide receiver 2. No, not a wide receiver 2, the wide receiver 2. So, you look at his game speed, people want to say he's lost a step. He is exactly as fast in 2017 as he was when he was the wide receiver 2. John Gruden said they put the chips on him, the pedometer on him, and he said he went 22 miles an hour in practice in a straight line with pads on. So that's great. So he is still a guy who can burn. He's still a guy that's savvy. He's a vet. The other part of it, people want to say he's old. Well, the thing about the NFL is that it is not like people want to talk about age curves, but there is no age curve in the NFL. It's flat. It's a mortality table. Either you good or you're not. When you're not, you're out of the league, man. You either are living or you're dead in the NFL. It's not like there's this baseball age curve where you slowly trot off into the sunset. It's the case that either you're good enough to be on the field or you're off the team. And Jordy Nelson is going to be on the team. Jordy Nelson is going to be on the team with a guy who couldn't beat out Michael Crabtree. And I defy you over the past 7 years to look at Nelson's career and Crabtree's career and say that Crabtree was a better receiver.
I like it. All right. So we've talked about a few guys who we aren't on, but if we're gonna go with the 0 RB strategy, and even if you don't, you're obviously gonna have to hit on some of these later wide receivers as well. I do have some guys that I want to talk about from sort of like some second-year guys that I think have a lot of questions around them, but could have some potential this year. But who are some guys if you're drafting right now? Once you get later into drafts, who are some wide receivers you're willing to take some shots on in sort of at a value?
You're talking about past what round, like the 10th or?
8, 9, 10 round, somewhere in that, as we get to that range. Who are you? Is there somebody that you think, if you're doing, I don't know, 30 best ball drafts, that you should try to get this guy at a pretty high clip?
Sure. So, I just went on a huge rant, a very passionate rant about Nelson. I think he's the wide receiver 42. He might be available there. And then you got guys like Robbie Anderson, who's going around wide receiver 41. And he would probably be available in that area. Rashard Matthews has a knee, and that's going to keep him down, and rightly so. It's a huge fish move to draft receivers who have injury problems in camp. You just don't do it, and that is one thing that I think that smart people who've played for a long time think they can outsmart injury news like that. And I think in the long run, you can't. So I'm off him, but if he turns out at some point during the preseason that it turns out that he's fully cleared, I like Rashard Matthews this year. Mike Wallace is another guy I really like, really late. And Kenny Stills is a guy that my boy Matt Harmon loves to death. And their talk today that is really going to bump him, I think, is that Devontae Parker might be on the block. Him between Stills and Bert Alert, Albert Wilson, I think that they'll be able to fill in if they do end up trading Parker for like a cornerback.
Yeah, I could definitely. I have quite a few still shares, so I'm happy to hear that that other smart people. Well, I wouldn't consider myself in that group, but smart people in general are talking about Stills, which makes me happy. So a couple of guys from that were rookies last year that were just sort of either non-factors or injured or whatever the case is. It seems like we're getting a very, very deep discount on a guy like Mike Williams. Obviously, there's a shot that he does literally nothing, right? Like there's always that potential. But right now he's going at wide receiver 62, which puts him, in like 160 overall. Any thoughts on Mike Williams or just sort of the Chargers in general with the Henry injury and everything else?
I don't really have a strong take on Mike Williams. And in terms of the Chargers, I think what you're going to find is that Keenan Allen's just going to get the volume, and that's just how they operate. When guys go down, they don't spread the ball around more. They just feed Keenan Allen more. Yeah. I think that Tyrell Williams has the better shot. He's proven it before. He is a deep threat. He is super fast on the football field. His game speed is well above average on the longer routes, and I think they can use him in ways that perhaps more than just a deep threat, more than just a decoy. And I think they may this year. And so as a general philosophy, when it comes to young wide receivers who haven't done anything yet, maybe have draft capital but haven't done anything on the field yet, maybe got injured, all that kind of stuff, I think that when they're cheap, I'm not faulting you for taking them, but I think there's better bets. I just think that anytime there's a guy with proven production on an NFL football field that is being taken too late, and you've identified him as a value, and then you have a guy with just potential, I'm always going with the guy who has proven production on the NFL field. So my way of thinking and my philosophy, I almost always miss on those guys, and I don't miss on them because I take them too early or too late, or I just don't take them at all. I just ignore them. I ignore players coming back off injury that I can't project. Guys like Keenan Allen last year, I knew he would probably be good, but there's no math behind it. There's nothing evidence-based to say that he would actually be good. It was a lot of hope, and it was a lot of projection, and it was a lot of extrapolation from a half season a year and a half ago. And those kind of things in general don't work out over the long run. And so I ignore those type of things. So I would go to someone else for second-year players coming off disappointing rookie years and who are able to look at skill sets. Guys like Harmon are probably better than that. I think that most players, if you're not deep in the weeds, if you're not a scout, I would recommend that you also avoid them.
Yeah. And then the Jacksonville wide receiver mess. Obviously they're headed by Blake Bortles, and whatever his value is as a fantasy quarterback is not necessarily tied into him being super efficient and lighting up the world with his arm. But all four of the wide receivers that we think may factor in are going extremely cheap. Marquise Lee right now is going at wide receiver 48. And then Cole, Westbrook, and Moncrief are all outside of the top 65 at wide receiver. Do you think that there's any value in getting, the right one here? Or do you think it's just Jacksonville and let's just avoid that as well?
I like Lee. I like Marquise Lee this year. Of them all, my model does not like Keelan Cole, but it appears that he may be the one who ends up getting the volume. So I have been drafting a bit of him over Dede Westbrook. And that's also, I have to fully admit, Dede Westbrook is also a shitbird, a lot like Mixon and a lot like Tyreke. And so I just I'm rooting for him to fail. So that is a part of it as well. So I think if I had to go, it would be Marquise Lee and then Keelan Cole. Keelan Cole, he was exciting at the back end of last year. He actually did some good stuff. People want to talk about the playoffs. Oh, he wasn't targeted when it mattered. But there's a lot of guys that have been targeted in the playoffs. Guys like Jeff Janis, guys that have played amazingly on the QB side in the playoffs, like Joe Flacco. And I mean, the playoffs are a special thing. And I think you need to look at a larger body of work. That is not something we have with Keelan Cole, but we do have news that says that he may be the default second to Marquise Lee, and that D.D. Westbrook will be coming in and lining up off the slot 3 wide receiver sets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and also I think it's extremely easy to forget, like, Marquise Lee was a second rounder. It's not like he's some scrub.
Right.
If you weight draft capital at all, you have to sort of consider that he's going to, and he's still there. Obviously, Allen Robinson is not anymore, and Lee sort of played second fiddle.
And Herms, remember when it was Allen Robinson and Herms that one year, everyone was like, "What happened to Marquise Lee?" But then last year, when Herms was a little dinged up, it was the Lee show, and Herms was a little dinged up, and A-Rob, obviously he was out for the year. But anyway, I agree with your take on draft capital, though. I just think that the question isn't Lee. I think he's the clear number one, and I think he is undervalued. The question is there any value in that second wide receiver, and who is it going to be?
Right. And it's also an important thing to remember when you're drafting. Like, I feel like a lot of people equate just, being a team's wide receiver one with being a wide receiver one. And there's only 12 spots to be a wide receiver one in fantasy. So and many years there's a team that sustains 2. So there aren't even going to be like 12 different teams represented at wide receiver one, most likely. So I think getting parts of good offenses and passing offenses is definitely something that you should be sort of focusing on. I guess maybe just a couple more, like situations that I've been sort of going back and forth on. I've been drafting a ton of Pierre Garçon. It seems like Marquise Goodwin is getting a lot of positive news. He has the YouTube clips and everything else, but also I forget who tweeted it earlier, but I can't find it now. But they were basically saying that Goodwin's the wide receiver one, and it's where do you land on that? Because obviously Goodwin got a ton of volume last year with pretty much nobody else there. So how do you sort of factor that in?
Yeah, the model likes Garçon over Goodwin. I think I kind of agree with that. Goodwin, I was looking at go routes the other day, and Goodwin ran a ton of them, and he wasn't targeted on hardly any of them. Like, he's a decoy. He's a deep route decoy, or at least he's been used that way in the past. And the question obviously is, what changed after Jimmy Field Goal came in, and what can we expect to happen this year? And I guess my answer to that is kind of the same as what we talked about with young wide receivers and stuff. It's really hard to project. You're really just guessing. And so the safe bet, again, going back to the model, again, going back to the math and what's predictive, is that Garçon, a guy who sees a lot of targets, a guy who runs those routes that see more targets, whereas Goodwin runs a lot of those deep routes. I think that, in the long run, you bet on the guy who sees the highly targeted routes. And again, camp news is camp news. It's like when they're doing these drills, especially before the games begin, they really are putting like a man on a man. They're making the cornerback take inside leverage with no help over the top just to do the reps, man, just so that they can get a feel for getting beat and have to run and do a trail position. Like, all those things are a part of camp. And I sometimes wonder if the beat reporters really know what they're looking at. And I don't mean that in like I don't know everything I'm looking at. It's not like that. But it is like, when they come back and say, oh, he's definitely the wide receiver and he was getting all the passes. Well, I think you don't get a lot of deep shots in the NFL. And so I think you got to work on them, right?
Right.
So I am just dubious that Marquise Goodwin is going to end up being the guy when you have someone like Pierre Garçon on the team.
Yeah, and you also have to factor in the Shanahan connection there. There's other factors at work as well that would sort of lead you to believe that Garçon, when healthy, is going to be the definitely the higher targeted guy. But probably also the more trusted guy in like higher leverage situations anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So any before we wrap up, any like super deep, like the model spit out something that you just couldn't, you had to double check?
Well, that was it was Jordy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've been talking about him a lot, and I know it's kind of a broken record if you've seen my Twitter or heard me anywhere else, but like it is a legit like head scratcher, like that a guy that the public might think is wide receiver 42 and the model thinks he's a wide receiver 1, wide receiver 8. Um, you know, I really had to take a hard look at it and understand why it was saying that. And at the end of the day, if it turns out to be right, I'm gonna be hugely profitable this year, and I'll be very happy about it. But yeah, I think Jordy Nelson's the guy. I think if you want to take a shot on the guy past the, I guess what is it going to be, the 6th or 7th round, I think he's a guy with just tremendous upside that a lot of guys are putting bad juju on for no really good reason.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thanks for coming on tonight, man. I really appreciate your time. Again, you can follow Josh on Twitter at Frisco Josh. You can find his work this year at 4for4. You can go to airyards.com, which I'm a frequent member of.
No, it's free. You don't have to be a member.
I mean, no, I know. It's one of the first places that I go to. It's like it's Air Yards and FF Statistics right now are like the two, you know, free places where I can just find literally anything that I need to write an article, and it saves a ton of time. So if you're curious about game speed, you know, any sort of volume, any defense stuff, check out airyards.com. And make sure I'm sure if you know me, you're probably following Josh because I retweet his stuff daily. But thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk during the year.
Absolutely, Matt. Enjoy the preseason.
All right, you too, man.
All right, man.